We're going to finish today before we do our Q&A portion with a data modeling exercise. And before starting on that, let me describe what I think data modeling is. So when you're building an application like the um, solo and team projects you'll do at the end of Code Platoon, you have a lot of different ways you could do that. You know, you there's different techniques for building applications, right? Um, and the way that we do it at Hashrocket, the way Jack and I did it together, is sometimes called agile, like with a lower or lowercase or a big a, depending on who's using the term. But the idea behind agile, it kind of goes along with the Sandy Metz quotes I threw out this morning, where you're saying we'll never know less than we know right now, so we delay making decisions. And so you work through the application and you don't commit to a data structure until you absolutely have to. Um, that's kind of our shared background of developing. And I would say that that's probably a really good way to go most of the time. There are certain kinds of projects where you have to, the data model is going to be so complicated that you really have to sit and try to figure it out ahead of time, I think. Um, Jack and I worked on a couple projects like that over the years where, you know, we're like, we don't even know if we can do this. So let's stop and let's try to get it all on a whiteboard and figure out how this is going to work. And then we'll start building the app. So I would say I don't do that most of the time. Most of the time I go for the first approach, but sometimes it makes sense to do that modeling up front. And so what we're going to do today is like sort of a hybrid of those two ideas. We're going to go through a problem and model it out, but we're going to do it like we would if we were developing it. So we're going to address a concern from the customer and add a little bit of data model. And then we're going to pretend we did all the coding, and then we're going to go to the next concern of the customer, and we're going to continue to build out the data model until we have the whole data model. So it's like a bit of a mix of both those strategies. So let me share my screen. Okay. Everyone's seeing Chrome in a whiteboarding application. Okay.
Yep.
So in the repository for all of our lessons, there's a data modeling directory, and it has a collection of what I call stories. And you can go in there and check those all out. I've pulled one group of those out of that repository, and I've thrown it into this block over here. And this set of stories goes with an application that I helped build a long time ago called PGCast. And it's actually a pretty relevant resource if you want to learn more about Postgres. It's pgcast.com. It's a series of screencasts, that hence the cast, about Postgres. So we started building this in, I'm not sure, like 2013, and it's got these videos starring Jack Christensen in episode 1, and then it's got like a transcript of the SQL that we use, and it's all up on YouTube. And we tried to go through some of the core features of SQL, and also solve some problems that we had encountered as we were getting better at SQL and learning SQL. So we built this application in our like spare time, and now it's a thing. So how did we do this? Well, we did something like what we're about to do now, which was when we build an application, we sit down and we write a bunch of stories. These are called user stories, and they're written in a syntax that is specific to how we work, but it generally is like applicable to any kind of development. So what I want to do is I want to read through each of these stories, and then we're going to try to create a database out of it, in the same way we would when we were developing. So let me read the first story and show you what I mean. So we use a syntax for our stories that is called given, when, then. Some people call this BDD, behavioral driven development, or in the Ruby land, it's known as Gherkin, because a very popular library called Cucumber has defined this as like something that they own. So we have a feature. Feature is just like a feature of how the application works. The name of it is Visitor Views Most Recent Cast. We decided on the term cast as the name for the videos, the screencast. So when you see cast in here, it's talking about one of these actual videos. Okay, so given I am a visitor. All right, well, let's stop right there. Given I am a visitor, does that imply any tables in the database so far? Do we need to make a database with tables yet? And I'll say
it
as we go,
implies some sort of person that is going to be utilizing whatever your service is.
yeah, absolutely. And I'll say as we go along, there's not really a right or wrong answer to a lot of the questions I'm going to ask. They're sort of just meant to be thought provoking and start us on a path of solving this problem. So I think that's true. It's a person who's using the application. A lot of times visitors aren't known to the application at all. Like right now on this app, I'm nobody. I'm not logged in. I might have gotten a cookie or something, but I'm just a anonymous user of the website. So from this line, I would say we probably don't even need a database yet. And we definitely could get away with not having a table. So to follow that Sandy Metz, idea, delay making decisions until you absolutely have to. Well, I'm going to delay making a database right now because I don't need one. Okay, next line. When I land on the PGCast site, that's just providing this HTML that you're seeing here. So again, no need for a database yet. Then I am presented with the most recent cast. Okay, so I feel like we're starting to get in the territory of needing a table. Right? I need to be able to show these screencasts. And for the cast, I see cast image, title, author, and description. So we need a way to persist this so that when I visit this page, I have something to show the user. And the most recent cast is this big block right here. So that's the thing we're seeing is this most recent cast. So let's imagine that we have this table, right? What should we call it?
Cast.
Okay, I love it.
Intro cast.
List
Yeah.
of casts.
I heard a couple of good suggestions there. I think probably the simplest one. The customer seems to think the word cast is a good name. They're throwing that all over the place. So maybe we can go with cast, and in Postgres it'll be plural. So casts. If this seems like a small question, it's actually not. It's a really important question because you're going to build a whole architecture around that word, and your developers are going to call it this, and that language is probably going to slip out into conversations with a customer. So you want this name to be as good as it can possibly be, as right as it can be. And if everyone at the company thinks that these are cast or screencasts, then that's probably the right word to use. Okay, so we have our casts table, and it looks like we need some data to be stored on it. So we use this like syntax of column name, type, default, and nullable, or let's say nullable. So the first thing we need is let's reverse these to be more obvious. I think we can just start with a title. Doesn't matter, but we need a title. So maybe we call that column title. What type should it be?
Varchar.
That sounds good. As Jack said, that's a alias for text. Seems like a pretty standard choice. A default, there probably isn't a good default. So at least I can't think of a good default for a title. So maybe we don't have that. Can it be null?
No.
I have all of the names hidden, so that was the correct answer. Great job. Yes, it can't be. We've said this a few times today, and I think stand by that. Like nullable things are bad, and in this case, what good is a record for a cast if it doesn't have a title? That's a really important piece of information, and I can't make a good argument for not having it be there. So let's say that it's not null, and there's no default. Okay, so then we need a image. We called it a cast image, but let's just use image. So what if we call this column image? What type should this be?
Should be a probably a string or text, because it's really just going to be a reference to a path to where the image lies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very pragmatic way to do it. It can be someplace on your system, or it can be like a link to an S3 bucket, depending on how, or something through a CDN, depending on how you want to present the images. But I think a string makes sense. We could have a default. This might be an okay place for a default. Like you might have, one thing you could do is you could say, well, if they don't upload an image for some reason, we're just going to show like a generic image that is,
Like just the logo of the company or whatever.
Yeah, just a logo of the company. Is a database the right place to store that? I don't know, but that's one thing you could do is you could say like images.google.com, placeholder.png. So then you're kind of rescuing your code if that image ever isn't there. I'd say that's a little more of a configuration thing, but it works in this case. So and is it nullable? Well, if we're giving it a default value, no, I don't think this should be nullable either. It's either going to be the thing that you save, or it's going to be the default. So I don't, yeah. I want this to be one of those two.
Questions of where the default lives, does it live here or does it live in the application? If it lives here, then it makes sense to say this must be not null. If we were going to store the default in the application, then it would make sense to allow it to be null, because we'd say if it's null, then do this other value.
Right. Part of this whole process that I think we've been hinting at but haven't really been saying is that we really believe at my company and Jack and I that like you want to have the database be a source of truth for your data, and by that I mean you want to be very strict about what you let in and out of the database, because if you do all your enforcement of data at a different layer, it's possible that the data can be bad. Like if you say Django is responsible for deciding what can and can't go into the database. Eventually something's going to get into the database a different way through like a mobile client or somebody typing in pSQL, or you just miss some Python code somehow, and then you're going to have values in there that are not what you want. And so we like to put these constraints in as many places as we can. All right, we're getting through the first story. We need an author and we need a description. So how about this author? What should we do about an author? Is that going to be a column on this table?
It sounds like it's going to be another table.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I heard it sounds like it's going to be another table, and I also heard maybe yes, it's going to be something we add onto this table. Would anyone like to take one or the other side of that conversation?
Shouldn't it be in a separate table, and then you would create a foreign key to reference it inside this main table that we have so far?
I would say that is probably the right thing to do. And that's what you most likely would do. But you have a choice right here too, which is to not do that. And the reason I would say that's worth considering is that we don't know, right? What is, if you have another table with authors, what are you going to get out of that? Well, you have a relationship, and you can say this author has 4 different screencasts and they all belong to that author. And you'll have, very strong integrity in your data, where every time that author shows up, it'll be the same record, so it'll have the same name. And if you update that name, it will show up on all those different pages. All of those things are reasons to do another table. But all of those things, so far I don't know that anyone actually wants any of those things. So you're right, it should be another table, but a very cheap and naive thing to do would be to just put it on this table right now. And that might be good enough. It probably won't be, but let's just keep it on this table for now, and then we'll revisit this in a minute, I'm sure. So you could put it on this table.
The you ain't gonna need it principle there.
Yes. Have you all heard that, Yagni? You aren't going to need it. You aren't going to need it is what that stands for. Just a good general purpose programming thing is like design for the problem that you have, not for a problem that you think you might have. And there's always like 1,000 exceptions to this. So I'm not saying that, it's not, there aren't exceptions, but it's much simpler long term to kind of like just be like, okay, what do I need right now? Can I change it? And also, can I change this later? What do I need right now is I need to show the name of an author, and I can change it later because it's relational, and that's really easy to do. So I'm going to do the dumb thing right now, if that's okay, and say, let's see, it's saying for the author, let's just say author name, because this says like, I see the author. Well, what does that mean? You don't see the authors, you see their name, their full name. So we could just do that. We could do the name. Author name, varchar, no default. I don't have a good symbol for no here, and it's not null, right? You always have to have an author, maybe. Okay, last item on the table, let's say description. description, type. So that is the-
Varchar?
yeah, I think so. It could be. Jack, is there any benefit to that being like a text type? Because of the length of it is usually a little longer. Actually, no, it's always pretty short.
Technically, in Postgres, there's really no difference between text and varchar. In other databases, there's been a limit where like varchar is limited to like 255 characters and you have to use text if you need a long text. So that there's a bit of that tradition of using varchar for short text and text for long text, but it's really meaningless in Postgres.
Does
Okay,
Postgres not then allocate a certain amount of data if you use a larger data type versus varchar and limit the number of characters?
No, actually, both varchar and text are implemented as a length and then just the amount of data. So it doesn't make any difference, if you have a field that could have a megabyte in it or a field that could have 10 bytes in it, it's still saved the same way.
okay. So I don't have a good description. I mean, you could just put some junk in there like TBD or enjoy this screencast, but and we'll say that that's not null too. So we have a nice table now with 4 columns that we have spelled out. They're all not null, and we can deliver this story. Now, typically tables in a database that uses an ORM are going to have it created at or inserted at and updated at. And these are just kind of implied to be there. So, and an ID or like a primary key, but we don't need to, unless you're like spelling out that primary key in some specific way, I think you can usually just leave it off. Okay, so we've gotten through the first story and we have data modeled the first story. Next, let's go to the next one. So, if I were delivering this, we'd go and actually write, make this work. We'd create these pages and then we'd write a migration that adds this to the database and give a couple records in there and then, go and check it out on the site. So story 1 is done. Okay, story 2, visitor views list of recent casts. Given I'm a visitor viewing the home page for PGCast, when there are recent casts, well, I don't really know what that means. So I would go back to the customer and say like, or the client or the CEO and say like, what does recent cast mean? Or I try to help them refine what that means, but let's just blow over it for a second. Then I see n number of recent videos as dictated by design. Okay, so we went and talked to the designer and they want to see 5 recent videos. Up to 5 recent videos. And the videos are sorted in descending order by date. Okay, so let's stop there. We're showing these screencasts, up to 5 of them. That's like completely a Python concern is like take 5 of them, but we need to order them by date. And that's where that's where you could get by with those 2 columns I just mentioned, created at and updated at. And updated at, not really part of it, but, or maybe it is. Are these columns going to support ordering, taking the 5 most recent screencasts? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Are these 2 columns going to suffice to do that work?
It depends.
Excellent answer. Tell me more.
So what if you, had an older screencast that didn't get uploaded on time? So when it was created, it could be out of date. So now it wouldn't necessarily be in the right order.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking about for sure. When you create your production website for the first time, maybe you have a script that puts 15 screencasts into the database because you've already done 15 screencasts. You just need to put it in there. Well, if you run a script like that, the records are going to get inserted in. You might be able to say the order they're going to be inserted in, but you don't really have a lot of control over the created at timestamp, right? It's just going to get marked at the minute those records went into the database, but that isn't really meaningful, right? Those 10 records that I ran the script, the fact that they're all microseconds apart on the same day is not actually going to support this feature, because this feature wants to have them in an order of when they were released. And that's not the same as when they were created in the database. So yeah, as Jeremy said, so these created at and updated at. We like to think of these as just like artifacts of the database and the ORM and the work that they do. We don't like mess with these really. So like I don't know what Django does to maintain these. In Phoenix, it's called inserted at, but I assume they have some sort of convention like this. We let Django or Postgres set these, and we don't change them or mess with them. If they get updated when we choose to update them, then they get updated. If we are using some sort of function that doesn't update them, then we make sure that they're updated so that they are reflecting when updates occurred. But we tend to leave these two alone. And so when you're doing your own applications, if you're ever like, man, I wish the created at was, 2 weeks in the past, stop and be like, well, why do I want that? Am I actually using the created at column for what it was intended to do, or am I like trying to overload it with some other idea? So I think we need some other thing that we can use to order these screencasts. What's another like concept? What would we call this concept that would let us put these in a certain order?
Published date.
Yeah, that's great. Published date. Following Jack's advice, we can make this a timestamp with time zone. Maybe.
Yeah, yep, timestamp's easy.
And the default is like now, but you're gonna like probably set it to be whatever you want. And that'll maybe just cover you for when you're, putting something new in the database and you don't want to say when it's published. It's now, and it's not null. So then we go back to not showing these because they're just implied. And this is a special column.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if it's not going to be allowed to be null, wouldn't the created at be simple enough?
Yeah, so the thing about this date is that we're giving this to the developer and saying, you can change this. We're saying to the developer, if you want, let's say you want to add a feature where a screencast is published tomorrow, and the homepage only shows things that have been published, which means that date has come and gone. This published date will support that because the developers, you're giving the developer the permission to change this, or the user of the app, if there's like an interface, you're saying this can be changed. Whereas my advice with created at and updated at is that those aren't meant to be changed by us. They're meant to be changed by our tools.
So I was asking that as more of a devil's advocate's question, because I would see null in the database as it not being published or released. So if we were to allow that to be nullable, then you could either, check to see if it's been released and not show it if it's not been released, or you could specify time in the future and then compare it against like the current date time to see if it's releasable. So I think null in that instance would have some value.
I could definitely see that argument. It could be null, and then you could say, right, it hasn't been published. As back to Jack's point, like nulls are challenging because, as we know, you are kind of saying like it hasn't been published or I don't know.
Right, but also putting a date in that's not accurate could make a developer think that whatever date is in there at the moment that they're trying to access it is good, versus giving them an I don't know, which means they definitely shouldn't display it because they don't know if they should.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Any thoughts on that, Jack?
Yeah, I think that this is one of those cases where, null does mean empty or it means I don't know, but it usually in any particular column only means one of those. So given that this is essentially a blog type thing, it never really makes sense to say, yeah, this was published, but we don't know when it was published. So if it's empty or if it's null, the only thing it really can mean is not published yet. So
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid point. To take an example, like the blog my company runs, Hashrocket.com, I think you can have published dates on there be not set. So that's an example of like this being, a valid way to go. And that means it's never been published. And then you can schedule it to be at a time in the future. And then when that time comes and goes, then it just, shows up on the website because the Ruby code picks it up out of the database. So yeah, I think that makes sense. A thing you'll see sometimes is like with databases that were not very well designed is it will say something like published Boolean instead. This is like a superior technique, I think, because now you have all this information about when it was published too. And it happens to perfectly support the story we just worked on, where we want them to be in some kind of order. So
the only exceptions that I've seen to that, as far as like make that a Boolean, is when we actually would do both. So if instead of this being a blog, if it was actually like a database of, say academic articles, and we wanted to know if it was accepted into a journal and when its journal date was published. Well, we might have some real old stuff that like, yes, we know it was published, but we don't know exactly when. So occasionally, if you do need to keep track of those two concepts, I know something happened, but I don't know when, then you will use the combination of a Boolean and a date, but that's quite rare.
Yeah, this is thanks for that, Jack. We're way down in the weeds now, but this is what designing a database is like. So hope everyone is following along. Okay, so we've satisfied the first half of the story, and then for some reason we wanted to say for each video I see more things. Okay, thumbnail, image. We could just show a different image of this, or we could take, this image URL could be pointing at a bucket, and then we could pull off like different sizes out of it. We could just assume there's a small in there and there's a thumbnail in there. So I think that the image column supports this already. We don't have to change that.
So
And
you
then
said something interesting there, Jake. You called it image URL.
mm,
You think maybe we should name that? As image URL instead of image, maybe.
yeah, the thing I like about that is that it's like it doesn't hide away the fact that it's a URL. It tells you it's a URL. And all throughout your code, no one's going to take this and put it, and think that it's an image somewhere else in the Python code. They're not going to, they're going to know to put this in an image tag and use it as a URL. So that has merit to me. Does anyone else care or think that's better, or do they like image?
I'm cool with image URL.
Alrighty. Yeah.
I think
Nice
it definitely supports understanding coming from the developer side. So, because especially if you're going to use an ORM that automatically generates variable names, then the developer using that ORM is going to understand what they're supposed to be using it with.
Yeah, and especially looking at it from the application and the ORM point of view, it's quite possible that you'll use some sort of library that integrates with S3 or does automatic image resizing. So it's quite possible in your Python code that you'll have like a casts class or something like that. And you might actually be able to say .image, and it will, load it from S3, and then you can say like .width and .height. There are various things like that where it actually is working with the image and disambiguating this is literally the image or the image class versus this is the URL of it. That could prove handy.
Yep. I think that's a good catch.
Quick question, Jake.
Yeah.
And this might be a stupid question, but does the fact that the videos are being hosted or stored in YouTube affect what we're doing right now? Since essentially all this information is already on YouTube, right?
Yeah, that's actually I really like that question because I think we blew past the actual video portion of this. Maybe we have the image, but well, so I can answer that from a business perspective, which is when we were building this application, we were like, well, it would be cool if we had this site that hosts these videos, but actually hosting the videos seems like a kind of problem we don't really want to solve. Like let's let somebody else deal with that headache. And there's a couple, YouTube, Vimeo, right? There's a couple of companies that have, YouTube has been like, doing this for so long that I think there's, it's a really good argument to make that like them having the video hosting for a little side project like this, I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, you're duplicating some information, right? Like when I click this video, my internet connection seems a bit slow, but when I click this video, it's actually an embed from YouTube. And I think we left that off when image URL, we might actually want it to be like video URL, but when you actually go to YouTube, all this information is like duplicated there somewhat. So, I don't know, it's more of a business question, right? Is that bad for us? What do you
I
think?
think another aspect of this is that just that idea of we don't have the YouTube video URL or ID yet. And that's kind of like the core of our application. But going this story-driven approach, well, we actually haven't gotten to a story that says we play videos yet.
Yeah. And I think when we wrote these stories, we hadn't decided yet to use YouTube. So we were just like, well, we're just going to show a picture. And then like later we'll replace that with a video or something. So
Okay.
yeah, to answer that question, I think this does need to transition to a video URL at some point as we go down the list here. And that's a code concern that our stories will tell us to do, or will make it obvious we have to do it that way. And the duplicating between YouTube is like, well, we just want to have our own site that like frames these videos in a way that, you know, YouTube is like a massive sea of information. We want to have our own thing that we own that's called pgcast.com that we can send the link out and it will point them to this collection. And also like YouTube does not let you do stuff like this really. We wanted to have a transcript. We wanted to be formatted code. We wanted to link to our employees on hashrocket.com. We wanted to tag things. So that was the idea for this being separated.
Another concept, or another reason why you might want to maintain that as well, is because what happens if you change providers that are hosting your, so say YouTube starts doing something you don't agree with as a company, and so you want to completely divorce yourself from that platform. Well, you have to somehow now acquire all that data versus having had it already.
Yeah, there's so many different approaches to something like this, right? Like we could be hosting it all ourselves. That would give us total power, but it would give us a lot more DevOps headaches, which we had like zero patience for at that time. But this is a hybrid approach where like if we decide we don't want to go with YouTube, we can upload all these videos to Vimeo, run a script to update these cast records that we're building, and in 30 minutes we can have swapped over to a different platform. So that's a benefit of doing it this way. But it was mainly driven by we just didn't want to be. We wanted something super simple. It's not a business where like we're losing value by not owning these things. A for-profit business would probably not want to do it this way. Okay, so we got through the first two stories. Okay, onward. I'm just gonna delete these. Visitor views the show page for a cast. Show page is this like term of art where you're viewing this page in particular. Episodes, and then the title is we decided to do like a URL slug. That's the type of thing that it wouldn't be described in a story like this, but we should definitely figure it out as we're building it, right? Visitor views the show page for a cast. Given I'm a visitor viewing the landing page for a cast for PGCast, that's what that should say. These stories were written 3 weeks ago and everyone was really tired and they were just typing random stuff. So we have to clean it up as we go along. When I click on a cast, then I'm taken to the show page for that cast. And let's spell out the URL too. And I see the cast name in the URL. So then we'll know to build that in. It's a small detail, but you'll notice a lot of web apps that you go to, they'll do something like this instead of like using an ID. I had a question in Slack that I have yet to respond to, but it was about IDs and what happens if you delete a record if you have 7 records, 1 through 7, and you delete number 7, and then you make a new record, what's the ID of that going to be? Well, the ID, I think the next val function, it just takes the next sequential value. It doesn't know or care about what has been deleted. So that's going to be ID 8. And so it's not uncommon in a production application to have, missing IDs. You have 1, 2, 5, 7, 20 or something because certain records have been deleted. And that's an argument for not using the ID in the URL, is that when you do it with the title, there's no way for a user to know that there was at one time 1 record or 7 records or 30 records. And there's no way for them to really URL hack their way to your records. They can't say, oh, I know there's a record number 7. So what if let's see if there's a number 8. You're like hiding that from them. And also as a side effect, giving them like a easier to read URL. But that's a bit of a digression. So I see the cast name in the URL, and for the cast, I see the video player. Okay, so now we need to actually figure out the video thing. And I think this image URL was like an early version of this where we thought we might have to separate the image and the video. But let's say the customer has decided that they want, or the CEO has decided that we want to use YouTube. So YouTube does both of those things. It both gives you this like screenshot, and it embeds the video. So we can change this now. Instead of the image URL, this could be like the video URL. And then, the default is, maybe there isn't a good default anymore. Or maybe it's like, like your intro video. So like if something went really wrong, you're at least showing something that like tells people what this series is about. I don't really like that. I think I probably just leave it blank. So the video player, the title, the author, the description. Okay, now we've got something new, a tag list. So we had this idea when we were building this app that we would be tagging each story with the Postgres version so that people would know, what the compatibility was for the thing that we were teaching. Because a lot of things we were doing were very new. They coming out like Postgres 9 or Postgres 10, and it wouldn't work on every version. So we wanted to have like 4 tags at the bottom: Postgres version 11, window functions, basics, and those would be the tags. So how could we represent that? How could we put those tag lists into our database?
So I'll throw out the naive approach first. Well, we could just have a text field and we could separate them by spaces.
Oh, okay. All right. So varchar, there's no default value. Let's say it can be true, because we don't really want to always have tag lists. So Jack is suggesting something like this. I'm
suggesting it as the naive approach. I wouldn't really recommend this, but
sure.
Just FYI.
Basics, Windows, Postgres 11, command, terminal, like something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to just kind of reiterate this point that like, this isn't probably what you would do, but it isn't a bad solution. And the reason it isn't bad is because you don't really know right now what tag list is going to be. And maybe you wrote all these stories and you do know, but we don't know because we're just reading these stories. We don't actually know what tag list is going to be. So to do something more complicated in this is also not wrong, but you're kind of taking a chance that features are going to come down the pipeline that are going to need it to be more complicated than this. And that is not always true. In the case of this application, we never actually added more than one tag. There's only one tag in the whole app. It's called Postgres version 11, because that was the version that we did all this work on, and everything was new for Postgres 11. So we never actually built more than one tag. So this actually would be a pretty good solution, maybe, for what that feature became, which was not very important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it might be interesting to talk through like what are the more advanced things? Where does this fail if we were, if we did do this simple thing and we needed more, what would be the thing that would break it? That might be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, let's do the more complicated solution first. So we need a new table that's going to represent our tags. What should we call it?
Tags.
I love it. Okay, so the tag needs to have, I see a tag list. Well, that wasn't very clearly spelled out in our story process, but we have a design. It looks just like this, and it says there's a tag and there's some words. So we need to have something to fill in this little square. What might we call that?
Tag name.
Yeah, that would work. Tag name. You could just do name too. Sometimes you think about like how you'll use this in the code. Would you prefer to write tag name, or would you prefer to write tag name? And I don't mean prefer like less characters. I mean like, what is more like English readable to you? I probably would go for name, but there's either one is fine, I think. Okay, so we have our tag name. We'll say that it's varchar. We'll say that there's no default, and it can't be null, right? Like, what good is a tag that doesn't have a name? That's the whole point of it, is to have a name, I think. All right, so we have this second table. How is this related to a cast?
And one thing that might help us answer that question is, what do we expect to happen if we click on that tag?
Great question. Great question. So the user comes and clicks here. Right now that doesn't do anything, but let's say that they could. What would they see?
Could it take them to another page?
Another page. What is on that page?
All the videos with that tag.
Yes. That one thing, sure. All the videos with that tag. So this could be, if we imagine the URL, it's like tags Postgres 11, and that is a list of all of the that's a list of all the videos with that tag. And we did something exactly like this on Today I Learned, which is that posts have a channel, right? So the post like belongs to a channel, but the channel also has many posts. So when you click on the channel, then you see all the posts that are related to it. And it's nice because it's like a two-way relationship. So that's one way to do it. And I think the way you'd represent that would be like an arrow like that. So the cast has many tags. I mean, it could go the other way too. Maybe it's an arrow like this, which is I don't know how to draw an arrow that goes both ways, but oh, there we go. So this could mean, an arrow like this would mean that a cast has many tags, right? That would let us show all of the tags that go with the cast, but the tags, the cast has many tags, but that would let us show what we're being asked to do right now. But also the tag has many casts. So that would let us have that page that Jack is describing. Was there a way you were thinking about it, Jack, that was different than that?
Not really. It depends. I guess the interesting point is how much we are implying by that arrow. We could be implying a many-to-many table in between there, or we could be implying, that tags has, cast ID, and we allow like the Postgres 11 thing to exist like multiple times.
Sure. Yeah. So, right, you might want to validate that name too. The name maybe has to be unique. So, what we could do is we could just do the "you aren't going to need it" solution right now, which is nobody's asking us to be able to click on that tag and show a list of things that go with the tag. So since nobody cares about that, and we can only do the work that people care about, let's just make it a I think they drew the arrow the wrong direction, but let's make it that the cast has many tags, right? And so the tags can be shared between different casts, but then you can show a bunch of different tags at the bottom, and then this goes away, and the hidden column here is, I guess I'm not sure where you'd actually put that ID.
Yeah, well, that would be the question, whether we're adding one table or we're adding two tables.
Right.
If we add one table, then tags just has name, and that's like the only thing in it. And we have like a cast tags table that
Right.
has a foreign key to cast and a foreign key to tag. That would be like the rigorous industrial approach.
Right, that'd be the join table.
Right.
Right, so then that would have a tag ID, cast ID.
This
Yeah,
is
so
also an example if we do it this way. This is an example where for tags, the natural key for a tag, well, it is the tag. So we may end up not having an explicit like ID column and a name column. We may just say name because it's basically the identity of it. That is the natural primary key.
yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so this is probably where we will break. And I guess to wrap up on this exercise, it gets easier every time you do it. These like super in the weeds questions we're answering is the heart of data modeling. And when you come at it with an open mind and you like try to come up with the best possible solution with yourself and teammates, you can come up with a data model that's really good, and it can make development go very quickly and smoothly, but you don't always have to do this. Sometimes you can say, this isn't how we want to approach this problem. We'll just like develop these features, and we'll let the features drive the data model. So are there any questions?
Just really quick. So Jack, when you were talking about not necessarily doing an ID, did you mean like tags, the table tags would have a name column and then you would do like name ID, or?
Well, what we would do is we would probably say the tags has a name column, and we would make that the primary key.
Right.
The foreign key from cast tags, we'd probably call that like tag underscore name.
Got it. Thank you.
Right, and that would have the benefit, Jack, right, of that would force that column to be unique because it's the primary key.
Correct.
Which is what we want anyway. we would end up having to build that some other way. Good question. Others?
I have a question about using like a serial key instead of using either some natural piece of data or a composite key. It seems like, and I'm not an expert in SQL or anything, but it seems like in a lot of the textbooks and stuff that I've been reading, they want you to use basically composite keys, or at least not produce an extra column that's just for the ID. Does that make any difference, or is there a difference between maybe the real practice and the theoretical practice or theory?
A lot of that depends on what is going to be consuming the database. So in like database theory, you do tend to use, I know what you mean, where you read like the more academic literature and you do seem to see more natural keys, and natural keys often tend to be composite keys. I think I'm fair saying most web development frameworks. The ORMs don't really understand composite keys very well. So if Ruby on Rails, and I believe Django is the same way, basically you have to use a single column as your key, and that pretty much leads you to, you have to use a surrogate key. You can still have a unique index on the other columns to have secondary keys, but the ORMs really tend to dictate the serial or other UUID, something like that. I think that's mostly pushed from the ORM land.
Okay, well, why don't we take a break? And let's take a 5-minute break. We'll meet up at 10 after, and then we'll do our